In the summer of 1987, the combine belts started snapping in Harlan County, Kentucky, and nobody could figure out why. Not the dealers, not the equipment reps, not the agronomists from the University Extension Office who drove out in clean trucks and took notes on clipboards and drove back without answers. The belts were snapping mid-harvest, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single afternoon, and every time one went, the machine went down and the crop sat in the field and the clock ran and the money bled. A farmer named Dale Combs lost 11 belts in a single season that year. 11. At $14 apiece in 1987 money, that was $154 in belts alone, not counting the downtime, not counting the grain that over-ripened while the machine sat, not counting the 2 days he spent driving to Harlan and back for replacements because the nearest dealer kept running out of stock. Dale Combs was not a man who complained easily. He had farmed 380 acres in the creek bottoms east of Loyal for 22 years, and he had seen equipment problems come and go, and he had always found his way through them. But by the end of that summer, he was sitting on his back porch in the dark, and he was out of ideas. Let me tell you about what was happening across the county that summer, because Dale Combs was not alone, and that matters. From Loyal to Evarts, from Path Fork to the ridge farms above Cranks Creek, the same story was playing out on farm after farm. The belts were snapping. The combines were going down. The dealers were shrugging. The equipment reps were offering explanations that sounded reasonable until you went home and thought about them, at which point they stopped making sense entirely. The rep from the regional distributor out of Corbin told 3 different farmers that the problem was operator error. He said it with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from never having operated anything yourself. He said the belts were being over-tensioned during installation, that farmers were cranking them too tight, that the solution was to follow the manufacturer specification more carefully. He had a laminated card with the torque specifications printed on it, and he handed it out at the co-op in Harlan one Thursday afternoon, and he seemed genuinely satisfied with himself. The farmers took the cards and went home and followed the specifications to the letter, and the belts kept snapping. By September of that year, the problem had a name in the county. People called it the belt plague, half joking and half not, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, word started moving from farm to farm the way word always moves in a small county, quietly and without announcement, that if your belts were giving you trouble, you ought to drive out to see Eldon Mabe. Let me tell you about Eldon Mabe, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Eldon was 61 years old in 1987, and he had been working on farm equipment in Harlan County since he was 14 years old, which meant he had been at it for 47 years, which meant he had been working on machines longer than most of the equipment reps had been alive. He farmed a modest place, 140 acres on a creek hollow about 6 miles outside of Loyal, and he ran a small repair operation out of a 2-bay shop he had built himself in 1964. From lumber, he cut off his own property. The shop had a concrete floor he had poured himself, and a wood stove he had welded himself from, a 55-gallon drum and a parts inventory that occupied 3 full walls of shelving and spilled out into the corners and across the workbench and onto a section of the floor that Eldon had designated the overflow zone with a piece of masking tape and a marker sometime in the late 70s. He had never advertised. He had never needed to. His reputation moved the same way word always moves in a small county. Eldon had grown up in the equipment business the way people grow up in it when there is no other option, which is to say, he had learned by doing and by failing and by taking apart things that were broken and understanding why they were broken before he put them back together. His father had run a small dealership in Harlan that sold international harvester equipment through the 50s and 60s, and Eldon had worked the parts counter from the time he was old enough to read a parts catalog, which in his case was about age 10. He had a particular gift for pattern recognition, for seeing the same failure mode in different equipment and tracing it back to a common cause that wasn't obvious until you knew what you were looking for. His wife, Norma, said he thought about machines the way some people think about people, which was that he was always wondering what was going on underneath the surface. He was not a large man. He was compact and deliberate in the way of men who have spent their lives working in tight spaces, and he moved without wasted motion. He wore the same thing every day: canvas work pants and a flannel shirt in the cooler months, and a chambray work shirt in the summer, and his hands were the hands of a man who had been working with metal and grease for nearly 50 years, which is to say, they were permanently stained in the creases and calloused in specific places that told you exactly what kind of work he did. He was not a man who talked a great deal. When he talked, people listened, because they had learned that he did not say things that weren't worth hearing. Let me tell you about how the belt problem came to Eldon's door, because it didn't come the way you might expect. He had been watching it all summer. Eldon Mabe was a watcher. He had been watching the belt failures accumulate across the county, the way a doctor watches a cluster of symptoms accumulate in a community. Quietly, noting each case, filing it away, turning it over in his mind. He had talked to Dale Combs in July when Dale had come in for an unrelated repair, and Dale had mentioned the belts in passing, and Eldon had asked 3 questions and then gone quiet, and Dale had figured the conversation was over. He had talked to 2 other farmers in August, same pattern, asked a few specific questions, went quiet, moved on. By September, he had talked to 7 farmers and he had a theory, and he was fairly sure he was right. The theory had to do with the belts themselves, not with how they were being installed. Let me tell you about the science of it because it matters to everything that comes after. A combine drive belt is not a simple thing. It is an engineered component that has to transmit power across a range of operating temperatures and loads, and it does this through a combination of the belt's internal cord structure and the rubber compound that surrounds it. The cord structure is what gives the belt its tensile strength, and the rubber compound is what gives it flexibility and grip. When a belt is manufactured correctly, these 2 elements are balanced against each other in a way that allows the belt to flex around sheaves and pulleys without fatiguing the cord. When something in that balance is off, the belt fails prematurely. It does not wear out gradually the way a correctly manufactured belt does. It snaps, sometimes cleanly, sometimes with a fraying that tells you something specific about where the failure initiated. Eldon had been collecting the snapped belts. Every farmer who came into his shop that summer and mentioned the problem, he had asked them to bring him the failed belt if they still had it. Most of them did. By September, he had 14 failed belts on his workbench, and he had cut sections from each of them and examined the cross-sections, and he had found what he was looking for. The cord structure in every single one of those belts was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in a way that would be obvious to a dealer looking at a new belt in its packaging, but wrong in a specific and consistent way that told Eldon exactly what had happened. The cord angle was off by a few degrees from what the specification called for. It was a manufacturing variation, probably introduced when a supplier changed a piece of tooling or a process parameter, and it had the effect of concentrating stress at the outer edge of the belt when it flexed around a sheave, which meant the belts were failing not because farmers were installing them incorrectly, but because the belts themselves were built wrong. He wrote this down in a notebook in his careful, precise handwriting. He noted the lot numbers from the belt packaging where he had them. He noted the measurements from his cross-sections. He noted the names of the 7 farmers he had talked to, and the equipment they were running, and the conditions under which the belts had failed. Then he drove to Harlan, and he went to the regional distributor's office, and he asked to speak to the equipment rep, the one with the laminated torque specification cards. The rep's name was Gary Stull. He was 34 years old, and he had been in the equipment distribution business for 8 years, and he had a good territory and a company truck and a confident manner that had served him well in 8 years of selling and servicing equipment to farmers who mostly did not push back. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built his professional identity around being the expert in the room, and Eldon Mabe walking into his office with a notebook and a collection of cut belt sections was not something his professional identity had prepared him for. Eldon laid the belt sections on Gary Stull's desk and explained what he had found. He was specific and methodical. He showed Stull the cord angle measurements. He showed him the failure patterns. He explained the stress concentration mechanism in plain language, the way you explain something to someone who you assume is intelligent, but who may not have the background to follow technical language. He told Stull that the problem was a manufacturing defect in a specific production run of belts, that the defect was consistent across all 14 samples he had examined, and that the solution was to identify the affected lot numbers and pull them from inventory and replace them under warranty. Gary Stull listened to all of this. He looked at the belt sections. He looked at the notebook. Then he leaned back in his chair and he said, "Mr. Mabe, I appreciate you coming in, but we've already identified the cause of the belt failures in the county. It's an installation issue. We've distributed the torque specifications to the affected customers." Eldon looked at him for a moment. "I've got 14 belts here that were installed to spec. I've got the documentation from the farmers. The belts are defective." Stull smiled. It was the smile of a man who has decided the conversation is over. "I understand you've done some work on this, and I respect that. But our engineering team has reviewed the product and there's no manufacturing defect. These are quality components from a certified supplier." He paused. "I think the issue may be that some of the older equipment in the county is running sheaves that are worn beyond tolerance. That puts additional stress on the belt regardless of installation." Eldon picked up his belt sections and his notebook. He did not argue. He said, "All right," and he left. "Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a man absorb an insult without flinching? Not because he doesn't feel it, but because he has already decided that the argument isn't going to be won with words? That's what Eldon Mabe did when he walked out of Gary Stull's office that afternoon. He was not defeated. He was not angry, or not in the way that shows. He was simply done trying to convince Gary Stull of something Gary Stull did not want to be convinced of. He had a different plan. He drove home, and he called Dale Combs and 2 other farmers he trusted, and he told them what he had found and what he intended to do. He told them to stop buying belts from the regional distributor. He told them he was going to source belts directly from a different manufacturer, a smaller operation out of Tennessee that he had done business with years earlier and that he trusted, and he was going to stock them in his shop and sell them at cost plus a small margin to cover his inventory investment. He told them to spread the word. They spread the word. Let me tell you about the next 6 months, because they are the reason this story is still being told. By November of 1987, Eldon had placed his first order with the Tennessee manufacturer. He had specified the cord angle and rubber compound parameters himself. working from the original design specifications he had obtained through a contact at an equipment manufacturer he had known for 20 years. The Tennessee operation was small enough and flexible enough to accommodate custom specifications on an order of his size, which was not a large order by industry standards but was large enough to matter to them. The belts came in and Eldon put them on his shelves and he sold them to the farmers who came to him. The belts did not snap. This sounds simple. It was not simple. What it meant was that 14 farmers in Harlan County ran their combines through the 1988 harvest season without a single belt failure attributable to the problem that had plagued them the year before. 14 farms, several thousand acres, one harvest season, 0 belt failures from the product Eldon was supplying. The farmers talked to their neighbors. The neighbors came to Eldon's shop. By the spring of 1989, Eldon was stocking belts for 22 farms. By 1991, it was 37. He had expanded the overflow zone on his shop floor and added a 4th wall of shelving, and his parts inventory had grown from a local curiosity to something that functioned, in practical terms, as an alternative supply chain for a significant portion of the county's agricultural equipment. Gary Stull drove past Eldon's shop on the county road sometimes. He never stopped. Let me tell you about what happened at the co-op in the spring of 1990, because it is the moment the story shifted from private vindication to public record. There was a regular gathering at the Harlan County Farm Bureau Co-op on the first Thursday of every month. A loose assembly of farmers and dealers and extension agents that had been happening for years and that served the function of a community information exchange, part business and part social and part complaint session depending on the season. Gary Stull attended these gatherings regularly. He was good at them. He was personable and knowledgeable, and he had a way of making farmers feel like they were getting insider information when he talked about upcoming equipment models or pricing changes, and he used this skill to maintain his relationships with the farming community, even as his distributor's belt sales in the county had quietly declined. Eldon Mabe did not attend these gatherings as a rule, but in March of 1990 he came, and he sat in the back, and he waited. The belt problem came up, as it often did, because a farmer named Ronnie Brock had just lost 2 belts in a single week on his corn planter, and he was frustrated, and he wanted to know if anyone else was having the same trouble. Gary Stull, who was standing near the front of the room, said that belt failures remained a known issue in the county, and that his distributor was working with the manufacturer on a revised installation protocol that should address the problem in the upcoming season. Eldon raised his hand. The room got quiet, in the way a room gets quiet when a man who doesn't usually speak raises his hand. He stood up and he said, in the same methodical way he had said it in Gary Stull's office 3 years earlier, that the belt problem was a manufacturing defect, that he had been supplying correctly manufactured belts to farms in the county for 2.5 years, and that none of those farms had experienced belt failures attributable to the defect. He named the farms. He named the farmers. He gave the number of belt failure-free operating seasons. He said the Tennessee manufacturer's name and the specification parameters he had used. He sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ronnie Brock said, "How much are they?" And Eldon told him. And Ronnie Brock said he would be out on Saturday. Gary Stull said nothing. His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because time is the only argument that closes a conversation like that one. Between 1988 and 1995, Eldon Mabe supplied drive belts to what eventually became 49 farms in Harlan County and 3 farms in adjacent Leslie County. He kept records of every sale, every belt specification, every customer. He kept them in a ledger on his workbench with the same careful handwriting he had used in the original notebook. The ledger showed, by 1995, 8 consecutive harvest seasons with no manufacturing defect belt failures among his customers. The regional distributor's belt sales in the county had declined to a fraction of what they had been in 1986. Gary Stull had been transferred to a different territory in 1993. His replacement was a younger man named Kevin, who came to Eldon's shop in his first month on the territory and asked if he could look at Eldon's belt specifications, and Eldon showed him, and Kevin went back to his distributor and apparently recommended a product change, because the distributor's belts got better after that. Eldon noticed. He said so to Norma one evening. She said it was about time. Eldon kept supplying belts anyway, not out of stubbornness, out of the simple fact that 49 farms had come to trust his supply chain, and he was not going to disrupt that trust because a distributor had finally gotten around to fixing a problem he had identified 8 years earlier. Let me tell you about the morning in 2002 when the letter arrived, because it changed everything and it changed nothing. Eldon was 66 years old in 2002, and he was still running his shop, still farming his 140 acres, still maintaining the 4 walls of shelving and the overflow zone and the ledger on the workbench. He had slowed down some. His son, Curtis, who was 38 and had been helping in the shop since he was a teenager, was doing more of the heavy work. But Eldon was still there every morning by 6:30. Still the one who knew where everything was. Still the one farmers called when they had a problem they couldn't solve. The letter was from the Tennessee manufacturer. It was a single page, typed on company letterhead, and it said that the company was ceasing operations effective at the end of the calendar year. The owner, a man named Harold Fenwick, whom Eldon had spoken to by phone perhaps 100 times over 15 years, but had met in person only twice, was retiring and had no buyer for the business. The letter thanked Eldon for his years of business and wished him well. There was a handwritten note at the bottom in Harold Fenwick's handwriting that said simply, "You were the best customer we ever had, Eldon. I mean that." Eldon read the letter twice. He set it on the workbench next to the ledger. He went out to the shop and he stood there for a while, looking at the shelves. Curtis came in at 7 and found him standing there. "What's wrong?" Eldon handed him the letter. Curtis read it. He set it down. "What do we do?" Eldon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We've got time. We find another source or we find another solution. We don't leave those farms without a supply." That was the whole conversation. Let me tell you about the next 18 months because they are the part of the story that nobody outside of Harlan County knows, and they are the part that deserves to be known. Eldon spent the fall of 2002 and the winter of 2003 doing what he had always done, which was gathering information methodically and following it where it led. He contacted 4 other belt manufacturers. He sent them his specifications. He asked for samples. He tested the samples the way he had always tested belts, not by reading the manufacturer's data sheet, but by cutting cross-sections and measuring chord angles and examining rubber compound consistency under a magnifying glass he had owned since 1971. 3 of the 4 manufacturers' samples failed his inspection. The 4th, a company in North Carolina that had been in business since 1952 and that specialized in agricultural and industrial power transmission components, passed. Eldon placed an order. He also did something he had not done before. He wrote down his specifications in full, formally, in a document that ran to 4 pages and covered chord material, chord angle, rubber compound durometer, sheave compatibility parameters, and acceptable dimensional tolerances. He had been carrying this knowledge in his head and in his notebooks for 15 years. He put it on paper for the first time because he understood, in the way that 66-year-old men understand things that younger men don't always see yet, that the knowledge needed to exist outside of his own memory. He gave a copy to Curtis. He gave a copy to the North Carolina manufacturer. He put a copy in the ledger. Curtis read the document and looked at his father and said, "You should have written this down years ago." Eldon said, "I know." The North Carolina belts came in and Eldon put them on the shelves, and he told his customers about the supplier change, and he told them why, and he told them the quality would be the same. It was. The 2003 harvest season passed without incident. The 2004 season passed without incident. The 49 farms held. Let me tell you about what happened in the spring of 2005, because it is the moment the story closes the loop it had been drawing since 1987. A man came to Eldon's shop on a Tuesday morning in April. He drove a late model pickup, and he was wearing clean clothes, and he was not a farmer Eldon recognized. He introduced himself as the regional manager for the equipment distributor, the same company that Gary Stull had worked for, now operating under a slightly different name after corporate reorganization. He said he had heard about Eldon's belt supply operation, and he wanted to understand it. He said his company had been experiencing ongoing belt failure complaints from customers in several counties, and he was trying to understand what was driving the problem. Eldon looked at him for a moment. He said, "Come in." He showed the man his specifications. He showed him the ledger. He showed him the cross-section samples he had kept from the original 1987 investigation, still in a labeled box on the third shelf. He explained the cord angle issue and the stress concentration mechanism and the testing protocol he had developed. He was methodical and precise, and he did not editorialize. He was 69 years old, and he had been right about this for 18 years, and he did not need to say so. The regional manager took notes. He asked several good questions, which told Eldon that he was serious and not just performing interest. At the end of the conversation, the manager said, "Mr. Mabe, I have to be honest with you. I went back and looked at our records from the late 80s. We had a rep in this territory who dismissed a complaint about this exact issue. I read his reports." He paused. "He was wrong. You were right. I'm sorry it took this long for anyone from our company to say that." Eldon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The farmers in this county lost a lot of money in 1987 and 1988 because of those belts. Some of them lost more than money. Ronnie Brock lost 2 days of harvest in a wet year, and his corn yield was off 30% because of it. That's real." He paused. "I'm glad you're trying to fix it now." The manager nodded. He asked if Eldon would be willing to consult on a revised product specification for the distributor's belt line. Eldon said he would think about it. He did think about it. He eventually agreed, and the document he produced for the distributor was a refined version of the 4-page specification he had written in 2002, and it bore his name in the header, and it was used as the basis for a product revision that the distributor implemented in 2006. Eldon never made much of this. He mentioned it to Curtis and to Norma and to a few of the farmers he was closest to. He did not consider it a vindication exactly. He considered it a correction. There was a difference in his mind between being vindicated and being corrected. And the difference was that vindication was about him, and correction was about the belts and the farms and the farmers, which was what had always mattered. Let me tell you about Eldon Mabe in his last years. because the end of the story is not the end of what he built. He kept the shop running until 2011, when he was 75 and his knees had finally reached the point where the concrete floor was more than he wanted to deal with. Curtis had been running the day-to-day operations for 3 years by then, and the transition was not dramatic. One morning, Eldon came in and did what he needed to do, and the next morning, Curtis opened the shop, and Eldon came in later and sat on the stool by the workbench and answered questions, and that was how it went. The 4 walls of shelving were still there. The ledger was still there. The labeled box of 1987 cross-section samples was still on the 3rd shelf. Eldon died in March of 2014 at 78 years old. He had farmed his 140 acres until 2010, and he had kept his specifications current until the week before he went into the hospital for the last time. His funeral was at the First Baptist Church in Loyal, and the parking lot was full, and the overflow stood along the wall, and several of the men in the room had calloused hands, and the particular kind of quiet that comes from spending your life working with things that don't talk back. Curtis gave the eulogy. He talked about his father's patience and his precision, and his gift for seeing what other people missed. He talked about the belt problem and the notebook and the Tennessee manufacturer and the ledger. He said his father had once told him that the most important thing about solving a problem was making sure you understood the problem before you started solving it, and that most of the mistakes he had seen in 47 years of repair work came from people who had skipped that step. Curtis said he had been trying to follow that advice his whole life, and he still wasn't as good at it as his father had been. Let me tell you about what happened at Curtis Mabe's shop in the summer of 2019, because the story doesn't end at the funeral. A young equipment dealer from Harlan, a man named Brandon Talby, who had opened his own small operation the year before, came to Curtis with a problem. He had a customer who was experiencing belt failures on a piece of equipment, and he couldn't figure out why. He had called the manufacturer's technical line. He had checked the installation specifications. He had replaced the belts twice. They kept failing. Curtis listened. He asked a few questions. He went to the 3rd shelf and he took down the labeled box of 1987 cross-section samples, and he set it on the workbench. He explained what was in the box and why it was there and what his father had found. He got out the 4-page specification document, and he showed Brandon the chord angle parameters and the testing protocol. He cut a cross-section from one of Brandon's failed belts, and he measured it, and he showed Brandon the measurement. The chord angle was off. Brandon Talby stared at the measurement for a moment. Then he said, "This is the same problem? After 30 years?" Curtis said, "Different manufacturer, same mistake. It comes back around." He paused. "My father said it would. He said, as long as there are people making belts who don't understand why the specification matters, the belts will fail. The specification exists for a reason. The reason doesn't go away." Brandon asked if he could have a copy of the specification document. Curtis made him one. He also gave him the name of the North Carolina manufacturer and the contact information he had for the current sales representative there, which was the daughter of the original sales representative his father had worked with, which told you something about how some things are passed down and why. Brandon Talby went back to his dealership and he sourced the correct belts, and his customer's problem was solved. He came back to Curtis's shop a month later, and he said he wanted to understand the whole testing protocol, not just the one measurement. Curtis spent 2 hours with him going through the specification document and the cross-section methodology and the sheave compatibility parameters. Brandon took notes in a notebook he had brought with him, a composition notebook with a black and white cover, and he wrote in it with the careful attention of someone who understands that what they are writing down is worth keeping. Curtis watched him write, and he thought about his father sitting on the stool by the workbench in his last years, answering questions. And he thought about the ledger and the labeled box on the third shelf and the 4-page specification document with Eldon Mabe's name in the header, and he thought about how knowledge moves through time when the people who carry it are careful enough to write it down and patient enough to pass it on. The shop is still there on the county road outside of Loyal. The 4 walls of shelving are still there. The ledger is still on the workbench, though it has been joined by 2 additional ledgers that cover the years Curtis has been running the operation. The labeled box of 1987 cross-section samples is still on the 3rd shelf. Curtis Mabe is 60 years old now, and he is not thinking about closing the shop because there are still farms in the county that need what the shop provides, and there are still young dealers like Brandon Talby who need to understand why the specification matters and why the cord angle is what it is, and why someone thought to measure it in the first place. The regional distributor's belt line, the one revised using Eldon's specification in 2006, is still in production. It carries no acknowledgement of where the specification came from. The farmers who buy those belts do not know the name Eldon Mabe. The belts do not snap. That's what happens when a man spends 47 years understanding something well enough to write it down, and then finds the patience to wait for the world to catch up to what he already knew.